morning. I'd like to welcome everybody, members and non-members, to our lecture. Before we start, we normally just announce our new members. So if you're here this morning, just a bit of a wave to Cheryl, Van Noonan, William, Coleman, Alan Henderson, Cameron Dodd, Chris Hockey, James Wisner and Mark Fenton Jones. So each month we would like to just acknowledge our new members. If you're here, welcome. If you're not a member, you can sign up today by card, that's no problem, and join this wonderful society. Another bit of announcement, John Hall, where's John? John Hall is a good friend of ours. John coordinates the lectures at the Kokoda Track Memorial Walkway. They had a lecture on the 8th of March, the author Mark Dapin. You may have seen that book at Dinnick's. Coming up on the 29th of March, it's a Saturday, is Steve Priest with the topic, How the Development of Photography Has Shaped Our Perception of War. And on the 14th of June, Ryan Buter with the topic of Adventurer, Digger, Spy, the many lives and tragic death of Harry Freem. So there's some flyers here on the table. We've got a really good association with the Kokoda Memorial Walkway. So if you're interested, there's some flyers out there. Thanks, John. So this morning, we have the pleasure of having Paul Handel speaking on us, as you can see, on the topic of Chariots of Fire, the development of the tank. Paul studied mechanical engineering after leaving school and worked for Email Limited Waterloo Botany in the 1970s. He then joined a German engineering company based in North Sydney in 1980. He was involved in large steelworks and open cut mining projects up until the year 2000. Paul joined the CMF in 1970, commissioned in 1972 into the Royal Australian Electrical Mechanical Engineers Raymond. Had a number of series of postings, 5 years as the OC of the LAD TSS of the first 15th Lancers. Promoted to Major in 1981, he served on HQ 2nd Division, Lance 2. Tenures at the Reserve Command Staff College in 1987, followed by posting to the HQ 2nd Division Electrical Mechanical Engineers. At the end of 1989, he was posted as a Research Officer, Royal Australian Armoured Corps, Tank Museum, and in Feb 1999 was transferred to the Army History Unit and became the Museum Manager of the RAAC Museum, later the Australian Army Tank Museum, a position he held until August 2012. Could we put our hands together to welcome Paul Handel?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to this presentation, lecture, and glad to see so many of you. First of all, before I start, may I talk a little bit about my lovely wife, Virginia, who helped with this presentation, cajoling, pushing, helping. Anyway, I managed to finish it at 8:30 last night. What we're going to look at this morning is the development of the tank. Now, so we don't get uninterested in it because we're not looking at various aspects. It will be purely on the tank. That is a tracked vehicle with heavy armament in a turret that turns. I I'd love to be able to talk about armoured personnel carriers and self-propelled artillery and all those sort of things, but we'll stick with that, otherwise we'll be here till close of business tonight. The other thing I'd like to say is a couple of years ago when the floods came into Queensland, there was the Army sent Bushmaster vehicles. They were wheeled vehicles. They have very good ground clearance and they were helping out. They interviewed one lady who said the Army have to get the tanks off the street. And I thought, okay. So that's what people think about tanks. Okay, have a look at these and do you think they were the first tanks? They only had manpower or horsepower to move along. They didn't have any armament and they were very, very slow. The development of the tank moved along and steam powers road trains helped the British Army. Main thing here was protection, and that's one of the aspects of tank warfare. The problem with steam is that you have to have a relatively large piece of equipment because steam engines have boilers and all sorts of other things. So not a good idea, but at least it started things. Then came one of the first track vehicles made by Hornsby, Foster and Holtz. These track vehicles were the first that the British Army had ever seen, and they gave a lot of mobility to the Army. You'll see the picture on the right hand side, that's one that is still preserved. Another vehicle, this time with armour plate and tracks to give it mobility, was this Kiln straight tractor. It was actually a normal tractor underneath, but armour plate on the top. However, again, no armament. The Australian engineer Lancelot Elton de Mol submitted a plan to the War Office for a tracked vehicle with very interesting items of track work, and this unit it never got to into production or even into a model vehicle. What you see here is the model which is preserved at the Australian War Memorial, and on the right hand side is de Mol himself. As you can see, after submitting a whole lot of plans, he joined the AIF and became a corporal, which is pretty ordinary for a fellow of his intellect. A land ships committee was started by the Admiralty. The Army weren't really interested in tracked vehicles. Why? I don't know. But they had a number of designs brought forward, and they all had tracks, and they were considered good mobility units. However, the problem was that they weren't mobile enough, and they couldn't cross trenches and have the speed that was necessary to move across the battlefield. The Landship Committee was formed on the 9th of September 1915. Just so you know. The Admiralty, as I said, had a Landships Committee, and Winston Churchill was the Director of the Navy. Thank you very much. He put forward or pushed forward this idea of land ships because the Army wasn't interested, and he took a little bit of interest. As we know, a very forceful man. After his pushing the committee a thing called Little Willie was born. It had tracks, it had armour plate, and you'll see on the top there's a round ring which was to put a turret on. Little Willie had good cross-country mobility. The armour plate, of course, wasn't tested because there's only one of them, and luckily Little Willie is still preserved at the Tank Museum at Bovington. It was nearly lost during the Second World War when a whole lot of vehicles and equipment were cut up to support the war effort and get spared, but somehow that was saved. You can say that's probably the first of the real tanks. The first tank, which is classified as a true tank, is HMLS Centipede. HMLS is His Majesty's land ship. So, and of course the Army didn't like that because the Navy was encroaching on the land. Then these vehicles' mother was built, and it had tracks, it had armour plate, and it had guns. You'll see that it's a long rhomboidal shape which enabled the tank to move across trenches. That was one of the problems before, that with a straight track you couldn't get it across the trenches. However, with the rhomboidal track, the nose at the front would drop down into the trench, and the rest of it would push it out of the hole. The tank, as you see, carried 2 6-pounder guns. These were naval guns and very limited arc of fire, and it also had at the back some steering wheels, which you can just see. These steering wheels enabled the tank to turn a little bit better than it was designed to do. Tanks in action. The first tanks went into action in September 1916. They had quite a number of these produced, and as you'll see, there's 100 tanks for the first order, and then they were followed by 50 tanks. Now, because the Navy couldn't supply enough 6-pounder guns, they put 2 machine guns in each sponson, and those tanks were known as females. So the tank marked 1 and a male tank. As you can see, and we talked about, it has 6-pounder guns. It has a steering frame at the back. This one is fitted with anti-grenade meshing on the top, and it was used to, when the enemy threw grenades at it, in theory they would bounce off. You'll probably see in the current conflict in Europe that a lot of tanks from Russia have this sort of weapon on it, or protection. Sorry, jumping here. The female had the machine guns. You'll see in the sponsons 1 of the machine guns. On the other side, there were 2 machine guns, and they were water-cooled Vickers machine guns. Why is it called a tank? There's a number of theories, and I won't go into them all. It's a little bit, what shall we say, difficult to find what was the real reason for the tank. But you can see there why it's called tank. Sorry about that. The first of the French tanks. The French were not far behind the British in their employment and design of tanks. A little bit later, but in essence it was about the same time as the Brits went into action. This is a very interesting design. Only had 75mm gun. It was in the right sponson, as you see. There was nothing on the other side. The nose of the tank acted as a wire cutter, and many vehicles and equipment that came after those tanks carried wire cutters. Even jeeps in the Second World War had angle iron at the front, and they cut the wire. The jeeps obviously didn't go into trenches or anything, but it was to cut the wire that the Germans put across to behead motorcyclists. Saint-Chamond, named after the factory where they were built. This one is quite a good tank. As you'll see, it has armour plate tracks, and the gun is at the front of the vehicle. And that's a most important point that we make for tanks. Perhaps this was one of the first electric tanks. And you'll see a little bit later on about one that was in the Second World War. The first German tank was the A7V. As you can see, great big box on wheels, on tracks. Gun at the front, similar to the Saint-Chamond. Machine guns at the side. You see little rectangular pieces where the machine guns were poking through. It had a crew of 18. How you get 18 men into a thing like that is beyond me. But they had to man machine guns. They had to steer and drive the tank, and they had to do braking and what have you, which is not in the driver's capability because he just sat at the front and wasn't able to lean backwards and pull various levers. There was only about 20 of these made. The tank you see here is preserved at the Queensland Museum. It has been taken to the War Memorial in Canberra to display it for the end of the First World War, and then it went back to Brisbane. That's where it landed when it came to Australia, and the Army didn't really want it, War Memorial didn't want it, so it stayed there in Brisbane. Just as an aside, the Germans did not have any preserved A7Vs in their collections. An offer was made from the German government to the Australian government to purchase the tank. Fortunately, that was rejected. What happened was they formed a committee about building a new A7V. The committee was led by a brigadier general who came to Australia with I think a colonel and a major. They measured up the tank completely, did all their drawings and what have you, and went back to Germany. The Germans are very good at telling you what to do. All the companies that had defence contracts with the German government were told to supply various items for this tank. You will build the hull, you will build the tracks, you will build the roadwork, all that sort of thing. And the resulting unit was very, very good, and you can't tell the difference. The other thing was, when it was first brought out, it was brought out at the Tank Museum at Munster in Germany. It was covered up and what have you, and I knew a Australian Lieutenant Colonel who was the Defence Attaché, and he told me they pulled the curtain away and the tank drove out, and the whole ordnance was absolutely flabbergasted. Tank operations in the First World War, we would think that they didn't do very much for being employed. But you can see the summary of these engagements of tanks with a few tank-on-tank battles, but mainly tanks taking over ground, going through trenches, blocking roads and those sort of things. You will see what a German historian said. Okay, after the First World War, everything powered down as far as industry went and as far as the services went. I won't go into what happened to the Navy and Air Force, but it was pretty much the same as the Army. Many in the civil and military had seen what had happened with tanks and how good they are, and they pushed for part of a new army. That's in the British Army. The French retained their tank army, but it became a subordinate of the cavalry, and the cavalry was still in charge of what the tanks did. The US said, no, we don't need tanks, and so they said, okay, we'll keep them, but they're sort of subordinate to everybody else. And this went on for quite some time as far as the Americans were concerned. Our friend Adolf Hitler, he knew what tanks could do, and he was very keen on all sorts of special things, whether it be tanks or aircraft or ships and what have you. So he formed some panzer divisions, and they were ready in the middle of 1935. One of the range of tanks in the British Army was the Vickers medium tank Mark II, and that is probably another one of the vehicles which can claim to be very similar to what the production put out right up till this day. You'll see the characteristics of the tank, and you can see how mobile it was. And so we know a little bit later on, we'll have a look at something. The driver was on the right side of the tank. The engine was on the left side of the tank at the front. The entire compartment underneath the turret was free, except of course for the gunners and machine guns and what have you. It had a door at the back. I ask you to keep all that in mind. Sorry about this. The Vickers Medium was the first tank received by Australia and used by Australia. We formed the Australian Tank Corps in the late 1920s. Four of these were the mainstay of that corps. The vehicle which accompanied it, and I can't go into that, was the Vickers Light Tank Mark 6A, and there were 10 of those. So we had some medium tanks, we had some light tanks when the war started. What sort of tanks did we have in the Second World War? And we'll have a look at some of those. There was the M3 medium, Grant and Lee. The original tank was the Lee because it had a rounded turret with no exit points and a very small aperture for the gun, and it had the 75mm gun in the sponson at the side. This was because they had an M2 tank, and this M2 had only machine guns mounted in it. When the German panzer divisions came into Poland and France, it was suddenly decided, we need a little bit bigger weapon. So, as an initial thing, 75mm gun was put in the sponsor. So the Lee is on the left-hand side. Sorry, I'm just seeing which way we go. The Grant is a little bit different because it had a turret designed by the British, and it was designed by the British because they wanted radios in the turret as their normal practice. so the turret had to be bigger, and it had a bulge at the back of the turret for the radios. And just so we know, they are two of the vehicles which equipped the 1st Australian Armoured Division. Australian Cruiser Tank, one of my favourite vehicles. This was built by Australia, designed by Australia, used by Australia. It didn't go into action. It was built because our suppliers from the UK at the beginning of the war started to dwindle because they were looking after their own selves, and one can't blame them. And all the tanks that they were going to send to the various allies, including Russia, had to stop, and they were put into action for themselves. The Australian Cruiser Tank was a very interesting vehicle in that it had a cast hull. Now, casting a hull of that size is not easily done. It was done by Bradford Kendall in Alexandria and was tested and various other things, and the hull proved very good for armour plate. Because we didn't have any other weapons, a 2-pounder gun was fitted. And I'm sorry, when we say pounder, as far as the gun goes, the pounder is the weight of the shell case. You'll see some are pounders, some are inches, some are millimetres. So just so that we know what was going on. I'll just go back one, and if you'll pardon me, the ladies pardon me, it was known to many soldiers as the boy tank, because at the front there was a casting to cover the Vickers machine gun. I won't go any further. So you'll see some of the characteristics, and the 3 Cadillac engines were put on a frame and slid into the tank. Now, this is probably one of the first times that a tank had a power pack which could be easily moved instead of taking off covers, lifting it with cranes and what have you. It basically slid in. They didn't have to use any other items to take it out. They had a trial in which 2 tanks drove from Liverpool to Melbourne. Now, that's a long way, and especially along the hidden highway in 1942. Both tanks arrived. One tank arrived with only 2 engines running, so that showed how versatile the tank was. Unfortunately, we only built 66 of those, and a couple of experimental ones, because at that time we started to get Lend-Lease products from the US. And I'm told that the other reason that it was stopped was because the Americans didn't want us making tanks, they wanted to supply us with tanks. The Matilda tank, a lot of you will probably know this. There's a gentleman here who works at the Lancers, volunteer, and one of their tanks is the Matilda. It had very thick armour, and it had the 2-pounder gun, or for close support, it had the 3-inch howitzer. One of the interesting things about that time was it had diesel engines, and diesel engines were sort of the flavour of the day, especially with the Americans. So a lot of Matildas were sent to Australia, something like 400, and we found that it was very suitable for jungle warfare because it was slow, it had thick armour, and it had good guns, and it had reasonable vision. There were several of the different types that we made, flamethrowers. We didn't make a bridge lane, but we made a dozer. And all that happened was a dozer blade was fitted at the front of the tank with some arms on it, hydraulic cylinders, controlled by the driver. There were a couple of other items, but I won't go into them. The Matilda fought in most of our jungle campaigns. So that shows you how good it was for us. Cromwell Mark 8 cruiser tank. The cruiser tank was a tank which was supposed to move in front of the forces and do reconnaissance and also fire on various enemy positions. That is, we've seen that the Matilda was an infantry tank. That doesn't mean that the infantry used it, but it means that it was supporting the infantry. You can see how it's a very good flyer, and the other tank is one at Pakistan. The Churchill. The Churchill again was an infantry tank, and it was very good, despite what people say, and it fought most of the time in northwest Europe. The Churchill also was used for what we call funnies. 79th Armoured Division, commanded by Major General Hobart, used these tanks to support various divisions. So we had bridge layers, we had flail tanks, which is a shown we'll look at that later on. We had flamethrowers, bridge layers, quite a few other bits and pieces, but excellent vehicle. Going to have a look at the American side of things. M4 Sherman tank, a lot of you will know about the Sherman tank. It was a very reliable tank, and it had good cross-country mobility, and it was used in large numbers by the US. You'll see how many were built. There were two types of hull, and I won't go into technical details, but one was a cast hull, one was a welded hull, and the other one was a composite hull, so it's half and half. We'll just have a look at those. The designations looked at the various power packs in them and the type of hull. As you can see, there's all sorts of engines put in because the industry couldn't keep up with one particular type, and particularly the first one, which is an aircraft engine. The Air Force would like some more engines. Here we have the M4 with a composite hull. As you can see, half the hull up to the basically the front of the turret is all cast. The rest of the hull is welded. The next one is the M4A2, which was a diesel engine tank. The US Army didn't particularly like diesel engines, so most of those were given to the US Marine Corps and to the British Army, and of course to the Russians. That is an M4A1 tank, completely cast. Santa liked it. Shermans were developed into the Easy 8 suspension. You'll see the suspension is somewhat different to the ones we've already seen, and it also had a much larger gun. These tanks were used in the later part of World War II in Europe. You'll see there that our friends the Israelis and used the tanks with a 105mm gun. That's a pretty big gun for a relatively, I won't say small, but a relatively medium type of tank. Russian T-34. This was a tank that changed their thoughts on tank, both tank production and tank use. The biggest thing was it had a slope on its glacis plate. Glacis plate is the front of the tank. And that deflected armour-piercing rounds to a certain extent. It had a 76mm gun. which was then a pretty big weapon for the time. The tank that you see has got half a swastika on it that belonged to the Finnish army. It was superseded by a T-34 85, which had a larger gun, a better turret, and perhaps a better engine. You'll see this one was on parade in Moscow. JS2. This was a heavy tank, but supported both the armoured and infantry divisions. So you can see it has a rather large gun. It has a diesel engine, which the Russians like. The pink tank is a tank which was mounted on a plinth in Prague about, I think, 1956 to celebrate, shall we say, the invasion of Russia. It had several paintings on it, shall I say, and the last one was painted the tank pink because of reactions within the organisation. Luckily, the tank was preserved and repainted in its standard pink colour. And very striking, it's at the Czech Technical Museum at Lausanne. Panzer IV. This, despite what everybody says, was the mainstay of the Panzer Division. This was because many were produced and it could be upgraded. They started off with a short 75mm gun, but it ended up a long 75mm gun. Out of interest, the coloured photograph is taken at the Australian Armourer and Artillery Museum in Cairns. If you want to see a lot of German tanks, go there. The Panther, probably also one of the best known tanks. You'll see that it started to have the T-34 for influence with the sloped glacis plate and the larger gun. They were a very good tank, as most of the German tanks were. However, they didn't make enough, and their reliability was a little bit suspect. Tiger and King Tiger. Everybody knows about the Tiger tank. Everybody that you speak to, what's the best tank Germans have? They always tell you the Tiger tank. Yes, it was a good tank. However, it weighed a fair bit, as you can see, 56 tonnes. The reliability of the tank was not good. It needed constant tension, and the crews, although they had the superior armour and the superior gun, weren't always in action. The King Tiger, that was the Germans' heaviest tank, except for another one, and it was had very poor cross-country capability. Both of the tanks, as you'll see, had very wide tracks. They learned that from the Russians, so that it would go over snow and ice conditions. The Mouse. This was the dream tank of Adolf Hitler. He liked to meddle in all sorts of things, make tanks instead of trucks, and all this sort of thing. You can see that it weighed 180 tonnes. That is a rather large piece of equipment. So, you couldn't transport it by rail, you couldn't transport it by road, because we just didn't have enough of that sort of support. They built two, and what we see of the coloured photograph is a combination of one hull from one tank and one turret from another tank. This tank is preserved at the Russian Tank Museum at Kubinka. And just a little aside, my wife and I have both seen that tank. Centurion. Most of us know about the Centurion. It was built by the Brits after the war and was to become the universal tank. This, it was probably one of the best tanks we had at that time. You'll see Australia bought some. We ended up, after all our bits and pieces, we ended up with about 104 tanks, plus armoured recovery vehicles. The first tanks that you'll see there have armoured skirts on them. They are to stop heat rounds, high explosive anti-tank rounds, which blow through armour plate. If you have side skirts, the round will go off, but it won't reach the hull. We used them in South Vietnam. Everybody who first saw that they were going to Vietnam said, no, this won't work, they're too big. In fact, the Centurion was probably one of the better support vehicles that the infantry had at the time. USM 48 pattern. I think it was the second tank which came into service in the US Army after the Second World War. You mightn't be able to see, but it had a cast hull and a cast turret. It was quite a good tank and was exported to a lot of nations. Again, you'll see one of the export nations was Israel. M60 and M60A1. These tanks superseded the M48. It's a pretty good tank, and it's one of the biggest tanks that the Yanks have built as far as quantity goes. Being a good idea, they were able to upgrade it in various ways. You'll see there's the black and white picture of the M60 that is taken at Puckapunyal during the trials. Australia trialled both the M60 and the Leopard. Leopard. This is the Leopard 1, as we call it, Leopard AS1. AS is the NATO abbreviation for Australia. It was a long-serving vehicle, and as you can see here, it lasted for quite a while. The 105mm gun, the Rheinmetall gun, was excellent. The V12 multi-fuel engine was also very good. Both tanks, I won't say the colour one is Australian, but it was used to welcome the Leopard into Australian service. It was taken in Germany. The fellow in the commander's hatch is Lieutenant Colonel Peter Jarrett, who commanded the armoured regiment when they received it. The Leopard in full green, that's how the tank arrived in Australia. In Bundeswehr green, as we used to call it, and later on it received all sorts of camouflage patterns, colours, and that's it. The S-tank. This is a little bit different to the tanks we've seen. It doesn't have a turret. It has the fixed gun mount, and how do you work the turret? Well, the tank moves up and down by hydraulic means. How do you turn the turret, which isn't there? You use a bearing speed to be able to turn the tank on its own axis and very fast, about the same as a turret. There was only 3 crew members, the driver, the commander, and the wireless operator who faced it backwards. The gun had an automatic loader, and the automatic loader was very good. It could pull rounds from a cage, it could push it into the breech, the gun would fire, the empty case would be ejected out of the back of the tank, and the next round loaded. That is a very, very interesting piece of kit. It was designed for defence against the Russians, who the Swedes thought may come over the border. The pictures in colour are of an S-tank which the Army Tank Museum received a little while ago, and it can do all those sort of things. On the Russian side, T-54s and T-55s. You see there that the tanks were lined up in the invasion of Czechoslovakia, and their characteristics were very much moved on to various other of their tanks. I'll have to move on a bit because we're running out of time. The Russian T-90, that's probably the last tank looking like T-72, T-55 and so on. You'll see, looking from the top, underneath the flag there are little blocks, and they are ERA, explosive reactive armour. So if you fire a round against that, the block will explode and slow down or stop the speed of the projectile and perhaps save the tank. T-14. This caused a lot of interest and perhaps excitement, and perhaps maybe we'll better look out. This tank appeared on a parade, and you can see what sort of a tank it was. It had all the crew in front, the turret was in the back, and it was a showpiece. There's never thought to be more than maybe 12, maybe 20 vehicles, and they certainly never appeared on the Ukrainian front. The Chinese also produced tanks. Their pattern was really of the Soviet tanks, although it moved on a little bit, and they eventually had 125mm smoothbore gun. The smoothbore gun doesn't have rifling, as you can tell, but it had big fins on the round, which enabled it to turn as it was going through the barrel and keep a very good trajectory. With these sort of tanks, they had a lot of protection on them, and they have to say they're a pretty good tank. The Chieftain. Probably heard about the British Chieftain. It succeeded the Centurion. It had a diesel engine, it had a rifled gun, and it manoeuvred fairly well. I've actually driven one. The tank that you see has window camouflage on it, and that is supposed to be urban camouflage. There have been some uniforms, I understand, made like that, and there's a number of vehicles in the British Army that were painted like that, not just tanks. The Challenger is the successor to Chieftain. A very, very good tank, and one of the ones that perhaps is being used in Ukraine. Makava, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but the word means chariot in English. A very, very unique design. I've included a picture of the rear of the tank, so between the boxes there's a door, and it's not really a door, it folds down and there's steps on it to allow personnel to enter. They can also load ammunition into the vehicle, and they can carry first aid, persons, stretcher cases, and so on. If you remember back to the Vickers tank between the wars, you'll see that this has the driver at the front. It has the engine at the side of the driver, and the fighting department where the turret is was fairly open. So, and it had a rear door, so very much like the Vickers Mark II. United States M1A1. This is the tank that we have at the present time, which has been superseded by the M1A2. As far as I'm concerned, it's a real good piece of kit. You'll be interested to see that it has a turbine engine, which is a multi-fuel engine in which you can use petrol, diesel, and a few other bits and pieces. We use diesel, and I'm told that the Americans do too. Very, very versatile, good armour, good weapon, and we like it. The M1A1 first entered service in about 2007. We bought 59 of them. Now they're being changed over to the M1A2. The difference is in 1A2 has a lot of electronic different parts in it to allow better acquisition of targets, easier for the crew to operate. Final. That's a leopard 2 of the Austrian Army. I believe at a demonstration that very interesting thoughts. Now, may I do one more thing? Back in 2016, I was given the opportunity to section a leopard tank, the Australian leopard. It was done at the Garden Island dockyard. And first of all, we brought up a turret from Puckapunyal from the range that had been shot at, so that the Navy could have a look at it and see how they could cut it and what results there would be. We had a few changes to do that, and the outcome was that we didn't cut it with a laser torch, we cut it with ordinary oxyacetylene. I was very, very taken when I was given that, which is a piece of steel from that leopard turret. And the Navy were trying out their laser cutters, and one day the petty officer came up to me and said, "Oh, we've got something for you, sir." I said, "Oh, okay." That's what I gave. So I was really, really attached to that piece of kit. Thank you very much for your attention.
Paul, we have got time for questions. Does anyone have any questions or like to ask for? John?
We went to both Malaya, Milne Bay, and the Japanese used tanks in ours, just we deployed no tanks ourselves. How come the Japanese could develop and deploy jungle and we couldn't?
Well, I think in 1941, 1942, we didn't have the quantity of vehicles that could have been used. We were there with the Brits, and they didn't have any tanks. Again, why would you bring tanks? Because they can't be used in the jungle. The Japanese proved that that wasn't the case, and they landed their tanks, I believe, a little bit north of Singapore, and basically drove down the road. There are photos of an ambush by Australian 2-pounder anti-tank guns firing at the Japanese tanks, but yeah, we didn't use any, we didn't have any. So that I think is the reason.
Why did it take so long for people to recognise that sloped armour was a really good idea? I mean, the Roman legions knew it when they used to form the turtle. Da Vinci knew it when he came up with the design. The Americans knew it during the Civil War with their gunboats, their floating guns. platforms, and yet it wasn't until the T-34 that people thought, hey, it's a pretty good idea to slope the armour because you get much better protection and also it deflects the shells.
Well, there's a saying is that when you do history, you don't accept it and you don't look back at it. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the tanks were going into high production, and you'll see that the Sherman didn't come in until after the T-34. And between the wars, there was very little development of the tanks, except on the German side. Now, the Germans were great engineers. I shouldn't say that because I worked for them for 20 odd years, but they are really good engineers, and they did not come up with the sloped armour idea, I think, just because they wanted to get tanks on the road, and the more tanks you have on the road, the better off they thought they would be. But the T-34 was the thing that probably changed the way tanks were made, designed and employed. Yes, sir.
One of the, I might have this quite right, the difference between focusing on a highly specialised tank as opposed to mass production of a fairly standard tank. The idea being, if you have a standard tank against a specialised tank would win. But if you surround a specialised tank with 5 standard tanks, you could probably beat it. What's your view on that in terms of strategy?
Well, I understand that NATO forces were deployed during the Cold War on the East German border, and the number of equipments that they had were very small compared to the ones on the other side. So they had to do something which would at least give them some time and what shall we say, ability to fire at all these tanks with their really good guns and electronics and so on. That's what they relied upon. Now, if you have, say, 10 T-55s coming out of the hill, and you've got one Abrams, which you didn't have, but one Chieftain or one M60, can that tank take out all those vehicles? Probably not. The Swedes came up, as you've seen, with the S-tank, and that was their idea, to be able to turn quickly, but their area that they were looking after was probably a lot different to that of Northwest Europe. Now, I don't know exactly because I've never been to Sweden, but yeah, that was the idea, and you're certainly right in what you say.
I noticed in the ladder tanks a smooth bore gun. I thought you needed rifle and a springing shell to get accuracy.
The smoothbore gun is actually more accurate than the rifle gun, and it has a longer range, and that's why everybody is going for the smoothbore gun. Russians, Americans, and so on. Out of interest, the Brits still use the rifle gun in the Challenger, and I understand that that's being replaced by a smoothbore gun, so that all the NATO armies use the same weapon and use the same ammunition.
Just a question about the Australian Tank Museum. I was there a few years ago and I couldn't get on the base because of restrictions. Is it open now to the public?
I don't know. I don't think it is, because there was a lot of changes being made, and of course when changes are being made they close it, and now with restrictions to get on the base, I don't think it's open. I'm not sure exactly how that might be, whether it's you have to apply in advance or whether you sit at the gate and so on. I can't say what that is because I don't know.
You didn't mention my favourite allied World War II tank, the Sherman Firefly. I was just wondering what the 17-pound projectile is in millimetres equivalent.
17-pounder, I think, is 76 million.
Yep.
Hey, how would you see the tank evolve to deal with the threat posed by drones, first-person view drones that we see? Sorry? My question is, the tanks has over the decades evolved to deal with new threats, explosive reactive armor, but with these drones, they seem completely vulnerable to this gadget that costs a few $100 that will take out.
Yeah, that's true, but the top armour of the tanks now is being reinforced, and you might go back to the first part of the invasion in Ukraine. A lot of the Russian tanks had a big wire screen over the top, known as bedstead armour, and that was supposed to defeat the bombs from drones and what have you. But there is a lot of work still to be done to improve the tank's ability to defeat the drone. The other thing is that once the top armour becomes thicker, they'll use electronic devices to upset the drone's electronics.
During the Second World War, I think there's probably a bit of a misnomer when it came to the Sherman. It said here that the Sherman tank, the A2 or the A3, came with a diesel engine, and they were given to Australia and the Ponds. And the Sherman was called the Tommy Cooker. Why are people so slow to learn when clearly you get hit in your tank, petrol, you're turned into a piece of toasted marshmallow in seconds? Why are people so slow, top brass, slow to learn? Like, really, they shouldn't be there. Pathetic. Why would the Americans go, oh, we'll just keep making them out of petrol?
The thing about that is petrol engines were in great supply in the US, and they have a thing about petrol that they have to use that. When they started to use diesel fuel, that was a little bit different. They had to look after it a little bit differently. That worked a little bit differently, and they gave away their diesel engine tanks as far as they could. And why did it take so long to learn? I don't come from the general farm, so I don't know that. And I won't go any further.
I'm just going to have one last question. We're just conscious of time, but you can always speak to Paul at the end and ask him your questions. So that's the last question.
At the end of the World War II, Europe was awash with the latest technology, tanks in Europe and everything else, and they were still producing in the factories and everything else. Yet here in Australia, I've often wondered why we didn't end up with a top of the range 1945 modern tank, which was bucket loads of lying around. Yet we had to persist with Lees and Grants after the war to go right up to when we replaced them with Centurion, because we got dudded. Europe was cutting them into pieces, turning them into scrap. Yet we had to persist with what in the 50s was really a dud tank.
That was for reserve units only, not for regular units. And that's a political decision. Go and ask Alba about why the Army Reserve Cavalry can't fire their weapons in New South Wales because it costs too much money.
Just the last Paul,
There was about 750 grants and leads supplied to us, and I think about 250 stewards. The Americans did that because they didn't want us to make tanks, because that would infringe upon their industry, and because they were given to us during the war and we didn't have to give them back, that's why we kept them for Army Reserve CNF units.
Just tied us.
That's right, and Matildas, and that was, and there, we had 3 Shermans. Two were on trial, in jungle trials from the Brits, and the one tank was an M4A2 diesel engine, came from America, again as an indication of what was possible with the tank.
It was only 10 years later we had the best tank in the world, the Centurion, at the time.
We did, and the
Didn't take long.
Centurion's a wonderful piece of kit, and I think a lot of us here would agree with that. Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't answer the question about submarine power.
You did.
It
Yes.
says 76
Can we put our hands together and thank Paul?